Welcome to the Contracting Officer Podcast. It's not just for contracting officers. If you're anywhere in the government acquisition world, this podcast is for you. Today, Kevin talks assisted acquisition services with Kim Yates, a former contracting officer and assisted acquisition services expert. This episode is brought to you by Skyway Acquisition. Visit skywayacq.com to learn more. Let's get started with Kevin and Kim.
So for this one, I want to welcome Kim Yates to the podcast. She is a Skyway team member. She's also a retired contracting officer, and she's a general FAR ninja. So to get us started, kind of give us your background, Kim.
Okay, sure. Good morning, Kevin. I worked for several agencies. I worked with DCMA for about 12 years. And then I worked for public building services for GSA and also assisted acquisition services. And I also had a couple of years when I worked for industry. Did construction contracting, architect engineering, contracting, service contracting, FAR 8, FAR 15, 16, pretty much had an opportunity to do a lot in the FAR.
Hence the reason I call you one of our FAR ninjas. I love that. So government contracting is hard, okay? Even when we're doing it right. Sometimes agencies can't get all the contracts done through their contracting officer team, right? They can't get it all done efficiently, perhaps. So they ask for help. That's where assisted acquisition services comes in, right?
It comes from FAR 17, actually, 17502-1A talks about assisted acquisition services. Now, I didn't even know about it until I started working with it, and you may not either.
Okay, so before we get into AAS or assisted acquisition services, I want to stop and say thanks. Thanks this week goes to Andrea Brown. She's from Huntsville, Alabama. I want to thank Andrea for sharing our podcast episodes, as well as sharing our posts about our training, the training that our company Skyway gives. The best way for people to find our podcast and to find out more about what we do is for folks like Andrea to share our podcast content. So thank you, Andrea. Okay, back to assisted acquisition services. So we know kind of what it is now. It's when the government, when a government agency needs help getting things bought. Oversimplifying it. How did you end up in AAS, Kim?
It's kind of funny because, first of all, how I ended up in GSA at all was that I had left the government for a couple of years, moved to Florida, came back up, and I felt like I was batting for the wrong team, actually. It was interesting to work for a contractor, and I learned a lot, but I felt like I wanted to be back on the government side. So I got a job in Boston for the public building services. And when I applied for that job, I thought I was going to be working with the schedule program. I didn't even know that they did public building services. So that was step one. Then I worked for PBS for 6 or 7 years, and I just got a little bit tired of buying services and construction in AE. And AAS was down the hall from us, and I had an opening and for a lateral position. And so I interviewed for it, and that's when I learned. I said that their mission was to do assisted acquisition, and that they supported different agencies. And I was like, whoa, that sounds really like a lot of fun. I'm going to take this job.
And it covered, like you said, you were working construction and A&E services. The ANAS covers everything. They can buy all kinds of different stuff.
Right. So the assisted acquisition services, they can buy anything, and we don't even know. Excuse me when I say we, because I don't work there anymore, but it's still to have it, right?
I do the same thing. Yeah. Well, once you're a contracting officer, it takes a while to lose track of the we, because I see myself as a contracting officer for a long time now.
The AAS isn't even going to know what they're going to procure until they have an agency come to them and say, can you take on this acquisition for us? It could be product, it could be services or supplies. Now in Boston, what I procured for was it just happened to always be services. Did a lot for the cyber commands. And I did a really big contract for the Army Geospatial Center, also had CDC, but it could be any agency, DHS. Essentially what it is that you have an agency that for whatever reason needs assistance with their acquisition, and it's from cradle to grave. They have to get authority from their agency to go. What happens is they have to fill out, the interagency agreement, it's called, which is basically a contract between the servicing agency, which is the AAS agency, and the requesting agency. And then they basically have a contract as to what AAS will do for them.
So it's kind of like outsourcing some or all maybe of the acquisition process. So the source selection, whether it's a source selection or it's whatever the acquisition process might be.
Yeah, exactly. And typically, I know for our team, it was cradle to grave. In some cases, we even helped to write the requirement because they'd come to us, but then it would be the end user would come, the requiring official, and say, we need, basically just like on, the back of a napkin, I need this. And the project managers would say, well, that's just great, but that's not a PWS. So we'd have project managers that would help them write the requirement. And then we do our market research and go through everything, obviously.
The question that jumps out to me then is that's how the agency brings the work to the Assisted Acquisition Services division of GSA or of the office you worked in. How do the contractors find this work when it shows up there? Is there a portal or something where all these contracts are posted?
No, so that's a great question. No, there isn't. I guess the short answer is
okay.
Because, again, to go back to what I said previously, the AAS region doesn't even know what they're going to be acquiring until they have the package, right? Okay. And so at that point, they're just going to be doing their market research. And this is where, with assisted acquisition services, the reason why, the FAR will say it's for economies, efficiency, and ability to leverage resources. And the first thing that the GSA anyway is going to do is revert back to FAR 8, which obviously these aren't going to be mandatory sources, but then there's the suggested sources per FAR 8, which is, existing contracts. So there's kind of a bias in GSA AAS to use, Oasis, Alliant, or any of the other agencies' existing contracts like SOUP and those, right? So it may be that they'd go after market research. They may already know that they're going to use one of these existing contracts. Or oftentimes, in my case, I usually went out through SAM with market research sources sought to see who had the sources that could supply this service.
So to jump, you mentioned FAR Part 8, and for those of you who don't know, FAR Part 8 is required sources of supply and services. And that's really where, there's 8.4 is federal supply schedules, which is a lot of what GSA does. FAR Part 8 is where people spend a lot of time when you're in these kind of contracts. But what you're talking about is, because there might already be a contract for it, you could go use that contract, which means that it might not even show up on sam.gov. Right. Or back to that question of, is there a unique portal? There isn't a unique portal. It goes through SAM if it's a big if, you choose to compete it. But you might already have a contract already in place that you could just put it on, which means that to the industry, the requirement just disappeared. It went from being with agency X, and then agency X gave it to GSA and had them do it through the Assisted Acquisition Services. GSA has a contract for it, which they competed it within that bubble of that contract, and it was awarded, and the companies who were trying to get the work might not even know the difference.
That's right. Except, I would say that would, caveat that by saying that even the requiring agency CO might have done that same process. Their market research might have led them to Oasis or Alliant or SOUP, one of the existing. So it's not anything different. I guess the only thing I'm saying is that GSA specifically, there's that extra bias towards GSA vehicles, right? But if that isn't the correct vehicle, then obviously they're not going to go to it. So number one, it may or may not go to an Oasis and Alliant, that type of thing. Now, if it is, though, too, or schedules also. I use the schedules a lot at AAS. However, I'd also do market research within those vehicles before competing it to make sure that it was going to be a viable source, if that makes sense. So I'd, first of all, for the big contracts that GSA has, like Oasis and Alliant, I keep talking about those to foot stomp it, is that they have teams that will review the scope before you the CO, put your requirement on there. They'll review your PWS or statement of work for free and then confirm, yes, this is within scope of our contract, or no, it is not. Because like with Oasis, there's different pools. There's like 6 different pools. And then also there's unrestricted and there's small business. So for my requirement as a CEO in AAS, I'm going to have to determine whether I can compete that under just a small business Oasis pool, or am I going to go unrestricted? And so I'm going to do market research within Oasis. And by the way, Oasis, Alliant, those are not just for use by AAS or GSA.
Correct.
Any contracting officers can use those. And I encourage it, even as outside the government, because it's a streamlined way. You don't have to go through the whole market research. That you have contractors who've already pre-vetted and who've already provided their capability statements, their past performance is good, their pricing is either sometimes in these big contracts, they've already have their rates approved. In other cases, it's, well, that's a whole different story. We won't go down that.
We will do a separate.
But I just wanted to make sure that it was clear that it wasn't just AAS that can use those vehicles, right?
Oh, yes. Okay.
So the point you were saying, how would the industry know? And I guess what I will say about how I would know is to be cognizant of the fact to look if they see market research or requirement that says GSA, FAS, AAS, then they ought to take a look at it, because unless they do take a look at it, they don't know who the requirement agency is. GSA has 11 regions that do assisted acquisition and FedSim. So that's 12. So 11 regions, like for instance, region 1 is where I work. That's got Boston. It's basically the New England center. You could look on the GSA website and see where the different regions are. And FedSim, which has a whole, it's basically AAS on steroids, because they have a really large team and they do, yeah, they do a really multi-million-dollar contracts. I mean, I did a contract, 2 contracts, 3 contracts. Okay, I personally awarded contracts almost $1 billion in region 1. But typically, I want to say that FedSim gets a lot of those bigger contracts. To go back to what you're saying, how would they know? No matter where they look, if it's Oasis, Alliant, Schedules, and SAM, key in on, do your market research, look for GSA, FAS, AAS, and then it'll say, region 1, region 3, whatever it is, which doesn't matter, because another side note is just because region 1 is in Boston doesn't mean that we're only going to do contracting for place performance in Boston. It can be anywhere. I mean, I did the place performance was Africa, for SOCOM for one contract that I did. So you wouldn't go by region, you just look for AAS. And then you see, in other words, like, and who are they supporting? Is it a DHS requirement? Is it SOCOM? Is it CDC? You don't know who it is. Basically, you don't know. It's a surprise.
Interesting. So yeah, the reason I say they could miss where the opportunity went is that it's going to show up. Let's say it's competed in one of these contract vehicles or elsewhere. It's going to show up as AAS, as GSA, right. FAS being the contracting activity.
Yep.
Whereas until they moved it, the contracting activity was the agency that you were actually targeting. It's not that they're hiding it. It's just, it's going to show up under different titles inside sam.gov, because now the acquiring agency is GSA. So you have to know what you're looking for, which again, this is a rabbit trail, but this is once again the importance of targeting, is that you can't do this with every acquisition under the sun. But if you're tracking a key few and one of them moves, you're going to know, and you're going to be able to find it because you know what you're looking for. But if you're literally chasing 100 things and any of them move, you're not going to be able to see deep enough into the opportunity to realize that it moved. Let's go back to why this is important. Why is this important for contractors to understand the AAS process in particular?
It's important for contractors to understand that agencies can go to an AAS activity to fulfill a requirement from cradle to grave, so that they should specifically look for GSA, AAS opportunities. And then read who they're supporting and decide whether they're not there, want to compete for that. And that includes RFIs and sources sought, as well as the actual solicitation. Oftentimes, once AAS does have the requirement, and typically mine have always been a base with 4 one-year options, if the requirement agency liked the fact that they didn't have to award and administer that contract, oftentimes it's going to be recompeted by AAS. So the other way to target that opportunity is to look to the FBS, all the regular places that you go to see, look up FedSim, look up AAS in Region 1, see what they have currently with the base and 4 options, and then, go off after it that way.
Interesting. So once it goes into AAS, it tends to stay there. Well, I don't know, maybe that's an overstatement, but it seems like it would.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd say tends to stay there either, because I don't know what the data is on that, but I know that we had, some that did stay and some that left.
So we talk in the podcast a lot about the requirement is the what, and then the market research and market research zone in particular is the how. The contracting officer is responsible for how this acquisition is going to be made, right? That we talk about that a lot. Well, in this case, the how is moving the acquisition process from the home agency, whoever has the actual requirement. Like you mentioned, like SOCOM. So I was a contracting officer at SOCOM. I had no idea whoever contract, because it probably wasn't in my portfolio, but even if it were, I probably wouldn't have known that the user, the customer said, you know what? The SOCOM contracting team that we have doesn't have the capacity to do this. I'm going to ask, in this case, Kim's team up in Boston to acquire this, right? So this is the how. The reason this is so important, we talk about this in the business sale versus a technical sale, and then podcast 222, and even talk about this in the GovCon Cube episode, where the how, you have to understand how is this acquisition going to be made? Well, the how in this case is the critical piece, is if you don't know that SOCOM changed their mind on having it go through the local SOCOM contracting office. By the way, if you're not familiar, SOCOM stands for Special Operations Command. But if you don't know that the contract acquisition has moved to the assisted acquisition services, you may miss it entirely. And like we said a minute ago, doesn't mean they're hiding it. It's just, it's in a different place for you to go look for it.
And another thing I think I wanted to mention back to FAR 17502, which is what gives the authority and discusses assisted acquisition. That's a good part to read, just to see what the parameters are. Like, for instance, an agency can't use assisted acquisitions to, divert or skirt around regulations. And obviously,
good to know.
Sounds obvious, but
sounds obvious, but you'd be surprised.
Yeah, right.
And you dropped a couple of FAR references here. 17502. Actually, 17.5 is interagency acquisitions. And for those of you who aren't familiar with FAR Part 17, it's not a place where people spend a lot of time. It's called special contracting methods, right? So it's where a lot of the, I don't want to say squirrely, but like unique things like options and stuff. So FAR Part 17, we could spend years in. 17.5 is this interagency acquisitions. And then 17502 talks about the stuff that you're walking through here. But what's really cool, going back to some agencies might not even know this is available. Some contracting officers, some customers, some government customers might not even know this is available. We could talk about this for hours and wear people out. So let's wrap this up under like the key points of the assisted acquisition services. Is that it's available. It's the first big news, and it fits a lot of the government customers' needs, because you guys could buy anything. It's just a matter of what shows up, and if it's a product or a service, for the most part, you could buy it for any agency.
Yes.
And so what makes it more effective, I guess, other than the fact that they can't get the work done? Like, what other factors draw into this?
Well, the one thing the customers always said is it's just streamlined, it's quicker. It's a flat organization, and the teams are just they're flat. The SES works right, at least in Boston, right with us, so we could get things signed quicker and everything. We do all the same approvals, J's and so forth, but it's flatter, and we're able to get things done in a streamlined fashion, way quicker than some of the other agencies that are backlogged and that have layers and layers of approval levels at different parts of the country. And even when we had to have, obviously at certain levels, we have to have high authority up to headquarters. Those meetings were coordinated via, Zoom calls and all that. So that's one thing. The other thing that agencies would be concerned about, and we could let them know right away, that the small business set aside credit goes to the agency, not to AAS. So that's big, right? That's really big for the agency because they don't, they're not going to lose that and they still can meet their small business goals. We're still going to, see if we can set it aside and they're going to get that credit.
So right there is two really key factors. One is that if you award this as a small business set aside, the agency that had the requirement gets credit, which makes them happy because Paul and I have done episodes about that's important from a meeting your small business goals perspective. But your other point of it being quicker and more streamlined, that makes sense to me because I'm going to go back to my SOCOM mindset is that I'm working in an office supporting a program. When I award a contract, the entire program, all the different layers within that program get to see what I'm doing. Mm-hmm. Whereas for GSA, it's one of the reasons you outsource things. Think of this like outsourcing the acquisition process. That's a piece of the overall process, right? Well, if you separate that one piece out, you can get it done more quickly. So it's a very interesting point that I hadn't thought of until this conversation of why it would be more efficient. Is that you're taking people that this is all they do. Like you've got your own private, basically acquisition shop that isn't, this is going to sound melodramatic, but isn't distracted by all of the other things that can go on in the agency to slow down the acquisition. And some of those things are important and needed, et cetera. And so a lot of times this doesn't make sense, but I totally understand that idea of it would be faster because like you said, it's a flatter organization. You have fewer thumbs to get up before you can move on getting an acquisition done. That's a really cool point.
Yeah.
So tell me about how does the core work? Like how does the contracting office representative for the government customer, like how does that whole process work? Is that outsourced too?
Yes and no. So I can say, I think it varies.
That's a contracting officer answer right there.
Right. Yeah, it depends. So the thing is, and again, let me just say I'm speaking for Region 1 because there's 11 regions in FedSim and they could all do things a little bit different. The teams are structured a little bit different. But I think it's a fairly common business setup that we had a contracting officer and a program manager and contract specialists as a team assigned to a particular a requirement. And also we would ask the agency to provide a core for the administration because, for instance, I had a contract, more than one, with performance in Africa and other countries. So obviously we're not going to send a core out there. We need people on the ground and they want to have that. So their core, that the agency still has a core on the ground who then provides information to our core, or they work, they team up together. However, they work that all out as part of the contract administration.
Yeah. So the idea is that this is all flexible. That's the beauty of this is you're outsourcing it customized to what the agency needs.
Exactly.
And so they're able to we go back to the path of least resistance. The path of least resistance to get this requirement met, going back to the whole purpose of a contract is to meet a mission, right? So if the mission is in Africa, you want somebody who works for the agency, like I'm making up, let's say it's the USAID, for example, or the Department of State. They want their own people on the ground. You guys aren't going to send somebody over there, but they want their own people seeing what's happening with this contract. But you're still managing the contract acquisition portion.
Exactly.
So this goes back to the contracting officer vertical, for lack of a better term, the contract specialist, contracting officer. That is the business side. It's the business sale, like we talk about in episode 222, that I'm going to keep foot stomping. That's how does the contract get done? Whereas the core, the contracting officer representative, they're more focused on the technical side of like, what are we actually doing day to day? Is the mission getting met? Give me the stuff that the contract is actually delivering. And so it's really cool that the flexibility is there, that you can outsource all of it. You can outsource part of it. It's almost like a business. I mean, AAS is run like a business inside the government.
It is exactly. It is run like a business in many other ways besides that. And then furthermore, too, once the team, the CEO and the PM get the requirement, then they're going to engage with the team and, do their mission. AAS, they want to do an outstanding job for the customer and the the end user and the contracting office, right? They just want to do the best job. And that's what they're devoted to, just that contract, getting that mission done and getting the right contractor, and then also making sure the performance is top rate. So that's why we're going to continue to give a PM, to a program manager, to oversee that whole performance, including payment, by the way, payment and closeout.
Wow.
The whole thing.
No. Speaking of the whole thing, we had a good episode today. We will have more stuff to talk about. I'm gonna land the plane here. So thanks again, Kim, for being on our podcast, and we will see you on another one soon.
All right. Thank you.
All right, that's it for another Contracting Officer podcast. Thanks to Kim Yates for joining us today. When you want insight on how the government acquisition world works from former contracting officers, Skyway's team of former contracting officers is here for you. Visit skywayacq.com or give us a call at 877-884-5280. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.